Wedding photographers. What's the weirdest wedding you've ever captured? Story 1. I had a wedding once where the couple was very eccentric, which was fine by me. I've seen all kinds of weddings, but this one took a wild turn right during the ceremony. The bride walked down the aisle in a gown that looked like something from a medieval fantasy movie. Think Game of Thrones meets Cinderella. The most surprising part? She was wearing a sword strapped to her waist. At first, I thought it was just a decorative piece or some kind of quirky fashion choice, but nope, it was a real sword. She explained to me later that she and the groom were both knights in training. Don't ask. I have no idea what that means. The weirdness didn't stop there. As the vows were being exchanged, the groom randomly pulled out a small goblet, passed it to the bride, and they each took a sip from it. Apparently, it was blessed water from a sacred well. Again, not sure if that was actually true, but it was certainly a moment. Then, during the reception, they had a medieval-themed feast complete with turkey legs, goblets, and a fire-breathing perfume. That was probably the most surreal wedding I've captured. It felt like something out of a fantasy novel. Story 2. A wedding I shot a few years ago will stick with me forever. The couple had a very non-traditional approach to their wedding vows. They decided to write their vows on pieces of paper, but rather than read them aloud, they handed them to a professional mime to act out. You read that right? A mime. The whole ceremony was held in a park, and at the start, the mime was introduced. The couple handed him their vows, and he started silently pantomiming them to the audience. It was honestly hilarious. The groom's vow was interpreted as him getting tangled in invisible rope, while the bride's vow had her being locked in a glass box and dramatically freed. The whole ceremony felt like a weird performance art piece. The guests were laughing the entire time, unsure of whether they should take it seriously or not. To be honest, I wasn't sure either. I have to give them credit, though. They definitely stood out. The rest of the wedding, thankfully, was more traditional, but I'll never forget that. It was one of those moments where you just stop, blink, and wonder if this is real life. Story 3. It was a normal Saturday wedding at a rustic barn venue, and things started pretty standard, until the groom's uncle showed up with a pet parrot. Now, it's not unheard of for people to bring pets to weddings, but this bird had a special role. The groom's uncle was the self-proclaimed bird whisperer, and for some odd reason, he had been entrusted with the task of delivering the rings during the ceremony. So there I was, photographing the beautiful vows, when suddenly a parrot swoops down the aisle with a ring attached to its foot. This bird was seriously on a mission, flapping its wings, squawking, and, of course, not listening to anyone. The bride was startled, and the guests were either laughing or holding their breath, unsure of how this was going to play out. Somehow, the bird made it to the altar, dropped the ring on the ground, and flew off just in time for the officiant to continue. It wasn't what anyone expected, but it made for an unforgettable moment. Later, during the reception, the bird was the highlight of the evening. It had learned a couple of party tricks and entertained the crowd. I've seen a lot of weddings, but I have never, ever witnessed a bird being part of the ceremony. Story 4. I once shot a wedding at a venue that was famously haunted. The couple insisted on having their ceremony at midnight, which, to be honest, wasn't the weirdest part. This was just their style. But as the ceremony began, we started hearing strange noises from the back of the hall. At first, everyone thought it was just the old building settling, but it quickly became clear that something else was going on. As I took photos of the bride and groom exchanging vows, the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty back corridor. Guests were starting to get nervous, but no one dared to get up and investigate. I did my best to keep my camera steady, trying to remain professional, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something eerie was happening. Right after the vows were exchanged, the lights flickered and the doors slammed shut. I'm not superstitious, but that was enough to give everyone the chills. Surprisingly, the bride and groom didn't seem fazed. In fact, they laughed it off and said the ghosts were just blessing their union. Later in the evening, we heard footsteps again, but this time, the bride declared the ghost was dancing to the reception music. It was a bizarre night, to say the least. Story 5. Okay, this one is a bit of a mix-up, but I'll never forget it. I was hired to photograph a wedding where the bride and groom had one very peculiar request. They wanted the entire reception to be a silent party. Instead of a DJ or a live band, everyone was given headphones upon arrival. The guests were all dancing to their own beats, with no music playing through the speakers at all. The bride explained that it was something she'd seen at a party once, and it was just so much fun that she had to do it for her wedding. While it was fun at first, the whole thing quickly turned into a bit of a chaos. Imagine guests trying to take a photo with a wide group of people, only to find out that no one was dancing to the same song. There were some awkward moments of confusion where people tried to talk to each other while simultaneously grooving to their own tunes, and it was hilarious. But on the flip side, it was strangely peaceful when you stepped away from the crowd. No blaring music, just people silently enjoying their own beats. It was definitely weird, but kind of magical in a way. Everyone's memory of the wedding was tied to how funny and bizarre the experience was. No one was complaining, mostly because they were too busy dancing in their own little worlds. Story 6. A wedding I covered had one of the most unusual twists during the reception. The couple had a very unique idea for their first dance. They were both huge fans of horror movies, so instead of a slow romantic waltz, they decided to do a full choreographed routine inspired by the classic zombie genre. The groom was dressed in a sharp tuxedo, but with pale makeup and fake blood dripping from his shirt. The bride, meanwhile, was in her stunning white gown, but with the same zombie makeup, her dress shredded in all the right places to give it that freshly risen from the grave look. At first, the guests thought it was a joke. The music started, and it was a slow, eerie instrumental tune, perfectly building the tension. Then they started moving. Jerky, stiff-legged dance moves. Very much like an old-school zombie movie. The groom bit the bride on the neck, and they spun around in perfect synchronicity, doing this unsettlingly creepy dance routine in front of their guests, who were all unsure whether to laugh, cheer, or run for the hills. It was so unexpected that everyone just stared, a bit in shock, but at the same time, they couldn't take their eyes off them. What made it even stranger was that halfway through the dance, the bride collapsed onto the floor and the groom began devouring her arm in a completely over-the-top, yet somehow believable performance. The whole thing was, without a doubt, the most bizarre and hilarious wedding moment I've ever been part of. Everyone went wild, and the rest of the night turned into one giant horror movie theme party. They even had a fog machine and a bunch of old-school VHS horror films projected on the walls for guests to watch while they danced. The couple was completely into it, and they definitely got their happily ever after with a twist of undead. Story 7. One wedding I photographed took a bizarre turn when the couple insisted on doing a flash wedding. But here's the kicker. They didn't want it to be a traditional ceremony. No officiant, no vows, no rings. Instead, they had hired a group of professional dancers who dressed in full wedding attire and performed an elaborate dance routine as if they were the couple. The bride and groom in the routine were completely separate from the actual couple, and the guests didn't realize it until about halfway through the performance. At first, the guests were confused as the music played, and these dancers, dressed as the bride and groom, spun and twirled around the hall, seemingly getting married right before their eyes. It looked like a beautiful romantic waltz, and no one suspected that this was a performance. The actual bride and groom watched from the sidelines, laughing, as their guests tried to figure out if they were witnessing some avant-garde wedding tradition or if they had walked into a Broadway rehearsal. When the dance ended, the real couple stepped up to the microphone, still dressed casually, and explained that this entire sequence was just an artistic performance meant to distract the audience and make them think about the concept of love in a new way. Most of the guests seemed relieved they didn't just witness a random wedding, and they embraced the couple's artistic flair. It was like something straight out of an art film, and the rest of the evening was filled with strange music choices and experimental dance-offs. People couldn't stop talking about how they'd been tricked, and for days after, I received texts from guests asking me if I thought the whole thing was a statement on the nature of modern weddings. Talk about a wedding that left people scratching their heads. Story 8. A wedding I shot last year was, without a doubt, one of the most unpredictable events I've ever been part of. It started off fairly normal, but things took a strange turn when the bride's grandmother decided to give a surprise speech. She was a little older, a little quirky, and had some very interesting views on marriage. When she stood up, everyone assumed she was just going to give the traditional congratulations speech. Instead, she began to passionately rant about how weddings have become too commercialized and how, back in her day, marriage was about honor, not about the color of the napkins. It quickly became clear that she wasn't prepared for the speech at all and was, in fact, making it up on the spot. She went off on a long tangent about how love has nothing to do with fancy dresses or expensive rings, but rather with the eternal bond of, wait for it, fish. She started comparing love to the act of catching fish in a lake. Guests were trying to hold it together, some awkwardly laughing, others visibly uncomfortable. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get weirder, she whipped out a jar of pickled herring from her purse and began blessing the bride and groom with it. She told them they would catch the best fish in the sea if they kept these pickles on their wedding night as a symbol of good fortune. Everyone was speechless, unsure whether to applaud or leave. As for the bride and groom, they were both laughing so hard that they couldn't even finish their reception meal without wiping tears from their eyes. I have no idea how they kept it together through the rest of the night, but they somehow did. That grandmother's speech still goes down as the most bizarre moment I've witnessed at a wedding. Story 9. I once photographed a wedding that involved a very intense trust exercise for the bride and groom. As part of their vows, they agreed to a unique challenge that required them to step into giant, inflatable balls. Yes, you read that right. The entire idea came from the groom's love of extreme sports, and the couple thought it would be funny to involve the whole wedding party in a massive game of human hamster balls. After the ceremony, the bride and groom, still in their wedding attire, climbed into these giant plastic bubbles. They started bouncing around the lawn like human ping pong balls trying to chase each other. They couldn't stop laughing, but I could barely keep up with them while taking photos. The rest of the wedding guests joined in. And what followed was an absurdly chaotic hour of people running into each other, rolling down hills, and trying to crash into each other while maintaining a sense of dignity. Spoiler alert, no one did. Despite the chaos, it was incredibly fun. The couple kept bumping into each other with their giant bubbles, trying to tag one another. Guests were forming teams, and there was this general sense of everyone just letting go and acting like kids for a bit. While it was totally unconventional and some people might have found it strange, I have to admit, it was one of the most joyful and memorable weddings I've ever captured. The couple looked like they were having the time of their lives, and honestly, I think everyone else did too. Story 10. The strangest wedding I've ever shot involved an unexpected detour into a mystery theater. It started off as a very standard ceremony, but once the reception began, the couple revealed that their wedding was not just a celebration. It was a murder mystery party. The guests, who had no idea what was coming, were handed envelopes with character profiles and clues to solve a whodunit scenario. The bride and groom had written the entire thing, and everyone had been assigned a role. The night quickly devolved into a chaotic but hilarious investigation, as guests tried to deduce who had murdered the groom, in the mystery, of course. What made it even more bizarre was that the bride had hired actors to play suspects and had set up elaborate crime scenes around the venue. One of the best parts? The victim was supposed to die midway through the night, and the groom, still very much alive, had to go hide under the reception table for the entire game. As the evening went on, it was clear that this was no ordinary wedding. People were whispering theories, pointing fingers, and running around the venue like characters from a detective novel. The best part was when the bride, who was a key suspect, revealed her true identity in the final act of the mystery. She was actually the mastermind behind the whole thing. It was so unexpected and surreal, and even though I've seen plenty of themed weddings, this one was in a category all of its own. It was like a reality TV show came to life, just with a lot more cake and confetti. Story 11. I was hired to shoot a wedding at an old abandoned church in a small rural town. The couple was super into the whole spooky vibe, and they wanted their wedding to have an eerie, gothic feel. At first, I thought it was a cool theme, and I was excited to capture something a little different. The bride wore a beautiful black gown with intricate lace details, while the groom sported a classic Victorian suit. The entire ceremony was candlelit, with red and purple hues making the space feel like something out of a haunted film. As the ceremony went on, I started to notice strange things happening. The air grew colder and guests were shivering, despite the heaters being on. There were strange creaking noises from above, as if something or someone was walking across the rafters. Everyone tried to brush it off as the old building settling, but I couldn't help but feel unsettled. The couple seemed completely unfazed, laughing and exchanging vows like they were in their own little world. Then, during the exchange of rings, the groom took a long pause. He suddenly looked directly at me and said, "Do you hear that?" I froze. The entire room fell silent, but I didn't hear any. The bride's eyes widened and she nodded. The guests began murmuring nervously, but before anyone could react, the chandelier above us swung violently. The whole room gasped, and I quickly snapped photos to capture the chaos. The groom smirked and declared, "Well, I guess even the spirits want to witness our love." The rest of the ceremony proceeded, but that moment left everyone on edge. When the ceremony ended and the couple exited, I noticed that there was no wind outside, yet the rustling of leaves in the trees seemed unusually loud, almost like whispers. By the time the reception started, everyone was in high spirits, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that lingered from that day. I've never been part of a wedding where the atmosphere felt so haunted. It was like the spirits themselves had been invited to join the celebration. Story 12. One wedding I shot had an unexpected twist that I never could have predicted. The couple had asked me to keep things very traditional and formal. No weird themes, no surprises. But about halfway through the reception, everything changed. The groom stood up and, in a calm voice, announced that he had prepared a special surprise for his bride. The guests were all curious, assuming it was going to be some kind of heartfelt speech or dance. However, what happened next was straight out of left field. The groom reached under the table and pulled out a full-sized, lifelike mannequin. This wasn't just any mannequin. This one had a suit on, holding a bouquet of flowers, and it was posed in a sitting position like it was part of the family. The entire room went silent as the groom explained, "This is Jerry, my best man." Apparently, Jerry was an old friend of the groom's who had moved away years ago and couldn't attend the wedding. So, the groom decided to bring a mannequin of his friend to stand in for him at the reception. At first, everyone thought it was a joke, and they all laughed nervously. But the groom was dead serious. He positioned Jerry at the head table and introduced him to each guest, asking them to shake his hand as though he were a real person. The bride was clearly confused, but she played along with it, trying to be a good sport. Eventually, Jerry was part of the wedding photos, sitting between the couple, smiling awkwardly with his bouquet. It was an unforgettable moment, but I'm still not sure if it was hilarious or just bizarre. Either way, it made for one heck of a story. Story 13. I had the pleasure of shooting a wedding that was completely themed around underwater adventure. The couple had spent the entire year planning every detail to make it feel like they were underwater. The venue was a beautiful seaside resort, and they had rented a giant aquarium for the ceremony. The aisle was lined with marine life-themed decorations, and the bride walked down the aisle in a gown that shimmered like fish scales, made of iridescent fabric. However, the real kicker was when they exchanged vows. The officiant, dressed as a deep-sea diver, had prepared a scuba tank for the ceremony, and as they said their vows, they had to use underwater hand signals to communicate. The couple had actually become certified divers in preparation for their wedding, and they thought it would be an incredible, immersive experience for everyone. During the ceremony, there was a brief moment where the bride's veil got caught in one of the water filters, and we had to pause as the team scrambled to free it. To make matters even more ridiculous, during the vows, the groom, getting nervous, accidentally released too much air from his tank, causing him to float up out of position. The whole thing was like watching a live-action underwater blooper. But despite the awkward moments, it was absolutely beautiful. The reception was held in an underwater-themed room with lights that mimicked the colors of the ocean, and the guests enjoyed seafood and tropical cocktails. Everyone wore snorkels and diving masks as part of the theme, making for some hilarious photos. The couple had definitely set a new bar for creative weddings, but I think they'd agree it was one of the most unexpected and chaotic, yet unforgettable days of their lives. Story 14. A wedding I shot a few years ago turned into a whirlwind of chaos and hilarity thanks to a surprise appearance from a famous celebrity impersonator. The bride, who had been a huge fan of the classic rock band, the Rolling Stones, had somehow convinced an impersonator of Mick Jagger to show up and perform a few songs during the reception. But there was one catch. No one in the bridal party knew about it beforehand. The reception was going smoothly, and everyone was enjoying their dinner when suddenly the lights dimmed and the music changed to a thumping beat. The guests looked around in confusion as a man in full Mick Jagger attire, complete with the iconic lip print on his shirt, took the stage. The real Mick Jagger impersonator began singing "Start Me Up" as the crowd went wild. The bride was ecstatic, jumping up and down with excitement. The groom, however, looked bewildered. But then came the twist. Halfway through the performance, the impersonator announced that he would need a volunteer from the crowd to help him out. Naturally, the bride leapt onto the stage to dance with him, but the groom, feeling left out, jumped up as well. A full-on Mick Jagger impersonator and real groom dance-off ensued on the stage, and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. The guests were in hysterics, and I had a front-row seat to a wedding that quickly turned into a rock concert. To top it off, the impersonator insisted on performing several more songs as the couple danced with their guests. The wedding, once poised and elegant, had now turned into a high-energy, rock-infused celebration. At first, the couple had wanted a classic and romantic reception, but they definitely got something unexpected that they, and their guests, would never forget. Story 15. I shot a wedding where the couple had a deep love for medieval history and thought it would be fun to bring a bit of that into their big day. The couple asked all their guests to dress up as medieval characters, knights, queens, and jesters, to name a few, and everyone took the request seriously. The result was a wedding that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a fairy tale. The bride wore a flowing, Renaissance-inspired gown complete with a crown, while the groom looked like a warrior in his armor. The ceremony was conducted by an officiant who had dressed as a wizard, and the vows were exchanged in front of an ancient-looking stone arch, which was, of course, surrounded by candles. It was an incredible sight, but things got even stranger during the reception. Rather than a traditional wedding cake, they had a banquet feast complete with roasted meats, bread, and flagons of wine. The highlight was the knightly games. The groom and his groomsmen had set up an obstacle course, and the bride had organized a jousting competition using inflatable swords. The guests were split into teams, each of which was dressed like warriors or peasants. It was an absolute riot as people competed in sword fights, archery, and dragon slaying, which was really just people running around trying to knock down a set of targets. While it was all very silly, the sense of fun and camaraderie was undeniable. Everyone seemed to embrace their roles, and the couple was ecstatic. By the end of the night, even the older guests had gotten into the spirit, with grandmothers and grandfathers in full medieval regalia. It was definitely a wedding to remember, one that could easily be turned into its own historical epic. Story 16. I shot a wedding that took an unexpected turn, and it all started with a very unusual request from the bride. She was obsessed with Disney, specifically the character of Elsa from Frozen. In fact, her whole wedding was themed around the movie, and everything from the invitations to the cake had some form of Disney reference. But the most unusual part? The bride asked me to capture the moment she let it go during the ceremony. The ceremony was set in a beautiful garden, and the couple had decided to exchange vows under a giant oak tree. As the vows were being spoken, the bride suddenly stopped, looked at the groom, and announced in front of the entire crowd, "It's time to let it go." Then, with the whole crowd watching, she dramatically ripped off her veil and threw it into the air like it was a cape, completely channeling Elsa. Now, this was not part of the usual wedding script, and I was stunned. Guests were unsure whether they should be clapping, laughing, or maybe even concerned. But the bride went full Elsa. She even started singing the song "Let It Go," right there in the middle of the ceremony. The groom, looking bewildered but clearly enjoying the spectacle, held her hand while she belted out the chorus with full commitment. By the time she reached the final note, the crowd was in stitches. What made the situation even more bizarre was that this wasn't the end. The entire reception was filled with impromptu Disney songs, with the bride leading sing-alongs. The Frozen theme continued, and she had even hired a performer dressed as Elsa to do a mini-concert during the reception. At the end of the night, the couple cut the cake together, except the cake was shaped like a giant snowman. It was a surreal experience, but you know what? The couple was in their element, and everyone had a blast. It's certainly a wedding I'll never forget. Story 17. I was hired for a wedding that promised to be quirky and fun. And that's exactly what it was, though I wasn't prepared for just how unconventional it would turn out. The couple had decided to host their wedding at a local petting zoo. That was the first thing that raised my eyebrows, but I didn't think it was that strange until the ceremony began. Instead of having a traditional procession, the couple walked down the aisle together, but they were flanked by animals. The bride had a small goat following her, and the groom was walking alongside a llama. Both animals were dressed in adorable little outfits, bow ties for the llama and a tutu for the goat. The bride and groom smiled and waved at the guests, clearly excited to have their furry friends by their side. Now, the ceremony itself wasn't too unusual, just a simple exchange of vows. But during the vows, the goat started nibbling on the bride's dress. It became a bit of a challenge to keep the goat from causing too much trouble as the groom said his vows. Meanwhile, the llama, probably the most well-behaved of the bunch, kept walking in circles around the altar, making odd noises that echoed through the ceremony space. It wasn't exactly serene, but the guests were laughing and loving every second of it. Things took another turn when the reception began. The couple had set up an area where guests could interact with the animals. Everyone got a chance to feed the goats, pet the llamas, and even hold baby chickens. But the highlight of the evening? The couple had a photo booth, and they encouraged guests to dress up as different animals. The result was a crowd of guests wearing bunny ears, lion costumes, and even full animal onesies. It was one of the strangest weddings I've ever captured, but the joy and laughter were infectious, and the couple wouldn't have had it any other way. Story 18. A wedding I shot last summer stands out because of how dramatic and over-the-top the entire event became, and it all started with the bride's entrance. She had hired a professional skydiving team to make a grand entrance to the ceremony. The groom and guests were all waiting on the beach, and there was this incredible sense of anticipation. I didn't know what was about to happen, but the skydiving crew was already there, suited up and ready to go. The plan was that the bride would fly in from above in her wedding gown, yes, in her full white wedding gown. As the plane circled overhead, everyone looked up in awe. I'm snapping photos, knowing this will be the highlight of the day. The moment the bride jumped out of the plane, it felt like something straight out of an action movie. She was gracefully floating toward the ground, her gown billowing like a parachute behind her. But then, things went sideways. The wind picked up, and the bride didn't land as planned. Instead of touching down gently on the beach, she veered off course and ended up in a neighboring tree. The guests gasped, and I quickly switched gears to capture the chaos as the bride dangled from the tree, her gown caught in the branches. Fortunately, she was unharmed, But the dramatic entrance turned into a rescue mission. The groom, who had been standing at the altar with a stunned look on his face, ran over to help free her. As if the skydiving accident wasn't enough, the couple decided to make the most of the situation and turn it into a surprise photo op. They laughed it off, and I was able to snap some amazing pictures of them holding hands under the tree, surrounded by their guests. What started as a dramatic, over-the-top spectacle ended with a fun, light-hearted twist. It was definitely one of the most unexpected moments I've had the pleasure of photographing. Story 19. I've seen a lot of weddings, but one in particular left me with more questions than answers. The bride and groom had decided to forego the traditional wedding vows in favor of something a bit more unconventional, a truth ceremony. The couple had invited everyone to gather around a campfire at sunset, and they started by each sharing a story about the other person. It was sweet at first until things took a strange turn. The groom began recounting how the bride once saved him from a wild bear attack while they were on a camping trip in the woods. Everyone was nodding along, but there was a noticeable sense of confusion in the air. The bride then proceeded to tell a tale about how the groom had single-handedly fought off a group of rogue ninjas to protect her while they were on vacation in Japan. At this point, guests were exchanging glances, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. The stories kept escalating, with more absurd and increasingly bizarre scenarios being described. The couple talked about how they had survived a shipwreck together, saved a village from a raging storm, and even fought off a fire-breathing dragon during a trip to the mountains. As the stories continued, the audience became more and more bewildered. It was like they were in a fantasy novel. The groom even handed the bride an elaborate sword as a symbol of their adventure-filled love. Finally, they both declared their vows, each one promising to always protect and support the other as they journeyed through life. The whole thing ended with a fireworks display, and though I'm still not entirely sure whether the couple was serious or just playing a massive prank, it was one of the most surreal weddings I've ever witnessed. The photos were a mix of wonder and confusion, but I'm glad I was there to capture the bizarre and unforgettable moments. Story 20. The weirdest wedding I've ever been a part of started out looking pretty typical, but it quickly became something straight out of a sci-fi. The couple had planned a futuristic wedding, complete with high-tech gadgets, LED lights, and a holographic officiant. The entire ceremony took place in a modern venue that felt more like a tech convention than a wedding, and the couple was adamant that everything be cutting edge. The first sign that things were different was when they entered the venue to a robotic greeting. A humanoid robot was stationed at the entrance, welcoming each guest by name. It was bizarre, but not the strangest thing to happen. The ceremony was held in front of a massive screen that projected virtual landscapes, from space to underwater worlds. As the bride walked down the aisle, she was bathed in artificial light, and the music was synthesized by a digital orchestra. But the real twist came when the vows were exchanged. The officiant wasn't a person at all. It was a hologram of a virtual character who spoke in perfect, monotone sentences. The couple didn't seem fazed, but the guests couldn't stop laughing at the surreal spectacle. Instead of a traditional kiss, the couple did some sort of awkward dance routine involving robotic arm movements, which they called the future of love. Afterward, the reception had even more surprises, including a virtual photo booth where guests could take photos with augmented reality filters and a 3D cake that was projected into the air before it was served to the guests by robotic waiters. The whole experience felt like it was plucked from the pages of a science fiction novel. But honestly, the couple loved it, and everyone went along with the high-tech theme. It wasn't just a wedding, it was an immersive experience that no one would forget. Story 21. One of the most bizarre weddings I ever shot happened on Halloween. The couple had this grand idea of blending a traditional wedding with a spooky, horror-themed reception, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. The bride walked down the aisle wearing a stunning white gown, but with one major difference: her face was painted ghostly white, and her hair was styled into an elaborate, eerie updo that gave her a bit of a zombie bride vibe. It looked beautiful, but definitely set the tone for what was to come. The groom wasn't far behind, wearing a black suit with an old-fashioned top hat and, to my surprise, a pair of sunglasses. When I asked about them, the groom explained that the sunglasses were a protection against bad vibes. That was only the beginning. The ceremony took place at an old mansion, and midway through the vows, the officiant revealed a special twist to the ceremony. The couple would have to make a sacrifice to the spirit of love, which, apparently, was some sort of theatrical role the officiant was playing. The couple, without missing a beat, performed this strange symbolic ritual where they sacrificed a pumpkin by smashing it with a mallet. The strangest part, the spirit was actually a fog machine that started filling the room with thick mist. The guests started to panic a little, and I had to move quickly to make sure my shots were clear, despite the thick fog. After the ceremony, the bride and groom led a procession where they handed out magic potions to the guests. These were little bottles of various colored liquids, non-alcoholic, that the guests were instructed to drink to seal the union. The reception took a sharp turn into full-on horror territory. There were haunted house-inspired decorations, a graveyard photo booth, and a surprise appearance by a ghost who performed a seance for the guests. To top it all off, the couple performed a waltz to a spooky, instrumental version of Thriller. It was a night of chaos, but in a strangely memorable way. If you're into gothic, horror-themed weddings, this one was definitely an unforgettable experience. Story 22. I once shot a wedding where the bride and groom's obsession with time travel completely changed the course of the day. The couple had a deep love for the concept of time travel, so they decided to make their wedding a time travel-themed affair. From the invitations to the decorations, everything was centered around different eras in history. The bride entered the venue dressed in a Victorian-style gown, but the groom, much to everyone's surprise, wore a full-on futuristic spacesuit. As if that wasn't enough, they had hired a professional to act as their time travel guide for the ceremony. The guide was dressed in a steampunk-inspired outfit, complete with goggles and a pocket watch, and he began the ceremony by explaining that the couple had just traveled from the future to be together. The ceremony proceeded with a strange time capsule ritual. Instead of exchanging traditional vows, the couple sealed items from different time periods into a box. These items were meant to represent key moments in their relationship, such as a ticket from their first concert together, a love letter from the bride, and even a replica of a time travel watch. The officiant told the guests that this box would be opened in 100 years by their descendants. The whole thing was so elaborate that I had to snap photos just to capture every detail. During the reception, the time travel theme escalated. Guests were divided into tables based on different historical periods. There was a medieval table, a roaring 20s table, and even a space-age table. Everyone was given costumes to wear from their assigned era. But the weirdest part came during the first dance. The couple had hired a choreographer to teach them a dance that blended elements from different periods in history: Victorian waltzes, disco moves, and even a futuristic robot dance. It was such a bizarre sight, watching them glide around the floor in an odd but surprisingly graceful mashup of historical dance styles. The night ended with the couple giving out little time travel-themed trinkets to guests: tiny hourglasses, vintage pocket watches, and even a few futuristic gadgets that were supposed to represent their timeless love. The entire event felt like a roller coaster through time, and I'm not sure whether it was the weirdest or the most fun wedding I've ever captured. Either way, it was certainly unique. Story 23. One wedding I shot will stick with me for years because it was completely interactive and involved guests in a way I had never seen before. The bride and groom were huge fans of escape rooms and puzzle-solving games, so they decided to incorporate elements of these into their wedding. It all started when guests entered the venue. They were handed wedding programs that weren't just programs but actually puzzles. Inside each envelope were different riddles and clues that would help them unlock different parts of the wedding. Guests had to work in teams, solving each puzzle as the ceremony unfolded. As the couple exchanged vows, a large puzzle piece was placed on a table in front of them. The officiant explained that this piece was part of a bigger picture that would only be completed by the end of the night. At first, I thought it was just a fun metaphor, but it quickly became clear that this was a full-on game. During the reception, guests found out that they had to work together to locate the missing pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle hidden around the venue. The craziest part? The bride and groom had set up a scavenger hunt with tasks like find the couple's secret song or recreate the couple's first date in a skit. Guests were racing through the venue, running from one clue to the next, while I tried to photograph all the chaos. It was like a wedding, but with the intensity of a competitive game show. The night ended when the last puzzle piece was found, and everyone gathered to assemble the massive jigsaw puzzle. It was a heartwarming moment, and the completed puzzle revealed a picture of the bride and groom. The couple had arranged for a photographer to take a picture of everyone working together to complete the puzzle, and it was an incredible shot. This wedding was certainly more interactive than any other I've ever shot, and the guests loved every minute of it. Story 24. A wedding I covered took a very unusual turn when the groom's best man showed up with a live animal that was supposed to be the wedding ring bearer. At first, I thought he had just brought his dog to the event, but no, he had brought an actual, real-life llama. I honestly couldn't believe it when I saw it being led down the aisle with a satin pillow tied around its neck, holding the wedding rings. The llama was wearing a flower crown, looking completely out of place among the tuxedos and gowns, but everyone seemed to love it. The problem came when the llama was supposed to stop at the altar. It had other plans. The llama wandered off halfway through the ceremony and started chewing on the flowers in the nearby garden. The groom's best man had to chase the llama down, all while the ceremony was still going on, and try to corral it back into position. The llama was having none of it. Guests were laughing, and the bride, while clearly amused, was trying to hold back her giggles. Finally, the llama was brought back into place just in time for the ring exchange. The couple tried to make light of the situation, with the groom even joking, "At least the llama won't take the rings." But things didn't end there. After the ceremony, the llama was let loose for the reception, and it ended up running around the venue with a flower girl chasing it, while the guests tried to keep their distance. It was an absolute zoo, but honestly, it was one of the most memorable weddings I've ever photographed. I've shot weddings with pets before, but a llama as a ring bearer? That's a first. Story 25. I shot a wedding where the couple had a very interesting request. They wanted the whole event to feel like it was happening in a secret underground lair. No, this wasn't a James Bond-inspired wedding or anything like that. It was just their vision. The couple rented a private space in a dimly lit warehouse, and they decorated the entire place with metal sculptures, Gothic chandeliers, and mysterious symbols scattered around the room. But the weirdest part? The couple arrived to the ceremony not in a limo or a classic car, but in a giant black hearse. The guests were told that the final ride was part of the theme, and they had to walk through a darkened tunnel to get to the secret lair for the ceremony. It was eerie but also kind of cool. The ceremony was conducted by a shadowy figure, dressed in a long, dark robe, and the couple exchanged vows by candlelight in a small circle surrounded by fog. It felt like they were making a pact to something much larger than just marriage. During the reception, guests were offered drinks from mysterious glass bottles and were encouraged to dress in black and silver as if they were part of a secret society. As the night wore on, the couple hosted an initiation ceremony for their guests, complete with bizarre riddles and challenges that everyone had to complete. The final challenge? An obstacle course involving laser beams, which were really just thin strands of light, that guests had to navigate to get their final stamp of approval on their wedding passports. The night was a strange mix of dark, eerie, and playful, but by the end, it was clear that the couple had achieved their dream of hosting a wedding like no other. It was a unique and memorable experience, and I still don't know if I've ever been to a wedding with a theme quite like that one. Story 26. I photographed all kinds of weddings, but one stands out because it turned into a full-blown circus. Literally, the couple, a pair of circus performers, decided to transform their wedding into an entire circus-themed extravaganza. From the moment I arrived, I could tell this was going to be unlike anything I had ever experienced. The ceremony was held in a big top tent in the middle of a field, and guests were greeted by clowns juggling and acrobats flipping around as they entered the venue. The couple was very specific about one thing. They wanted their wedding to feel like a performance. The bride entered the tent riding on the back of an elephant. Yes, you read that right, an elephant. She waved to the guests as the elephant slowly made its way down the aisle, with the groom eagerly waiting under a giant, colorful arch. The wedding vows were exchanged while a group of fire breathers performed in the background, the flames lighting up the night sky. It was all a bit surreal, but the couple was clearly in their element. The reception was even more over the top. There were trapeze artists performing above the guests as they ate, and at one point the bride and groom disappeared behind the tent for a few moments. When they reappeared, they had changed into full clown costumes, complete with red noses, oversized shoes, and rainbow wigs. They led the guests in a wild conga line around the tent, and for a moment, it felt like we were all part of a giant circus carnival rather than a wedding. As the night went on, the acrobats invited guests to join in on some of the performances, and before long, the whole event became a chaotic circus where the couple was the ringmasters. There were juggling contests, acrobatics, and even a few impromptu magic tricks. It was the most unpredictable wedding I've ever shot, but the sheer joy and chaos made it one of the most memorable events I've ever been part of. Story 27. A wedding I shot a few years ago took a very strange turn during the reception when the bride announced that she and her groom had one final surprise for the guests. The couple had decided to host a mystery dinner-style reception where everyone was assigned a role to play. Guests were given envelopes with their new identities. Some were cast as detectives, others as suspects, and a few were given roles as victims. The mystery? Who would die during the night's events, and who would solve the crime? The bride and groom, dressed in classic wedding attire, had set the stage for a murder mystery dinner, with the officiant playing the role of the detective who would guide everyone through the evening. At first, it was just a fun game, with guests whispering theories about who the victim would be and what the crime could be. But as the night went on, things got very serious. The first victim, a guest who had been assigned the role of a mysterious stranger, suddenly dropped dead on the floor in dramatic fashion, right in the middle of the bride's speech. It sent a ripple of shock through the guests, who had no idea whether it was part of the show or a real emergency. The bride, however, remained calm. She had organized the whole event and knew exactly what was happening. The guests were tasked with solving the mystery over dinner, with clues hidden in their meal courses. They had to figure out who the killer was, using their newly assigned roles and the cryptic notes scattered around the tables. By the time dessert was served, tensions were high, and everyone was fully invested in the mystery. The final reveal came as the bride and groom dramatically unmasked the killer and explained how they had orchestrated the entire night. It was a complete mind-bender, and guests spent the rest of the evening talking about their favorite parts of the show. It was definitely one of the most unique weddings I've ever shot. And while it wasn't your traditional event, it left everyone talking for months afterward. It was a wedding and a mystery thriller all rolled into one. Story 28. One of the weirdest weddings I've ever photographed took place in a treehouse. Yes, you read that correctly, a treehouse wedding. The couple, both avid nature lovers and adventurers, decided to take their love for the outdoors to the next level by getting married high up in the trees. The ceremony took place in a forest, and the treehouse was built specifically for the occasion, high up in a giant oak. The couple had envisioned a small, intimate ceremony with only close family and friends in attendance. The bride wore a flowing bohemian-style gown that looked like something straight out of a fairy tale, while the groom wore a loose linen suit, barefoot of course. The guests had to climb a long wooden staircase to reach the treehouse, which made the entire event feel like a secret gathering in the woods. The ceremony itself was surprisingly simple. The officiant, who was also a close friend of the couple, performed the vows as the guests looked on from the balcony of the treehouse. The view was absolutely breathtaking, with the forest stretching out beneath us. Everything was going smoothly until, in the middle of the vows, a squirrel decided to make an appearance. The tiny creature scurried up the side of the treehouse and began circling the couple. The bride was visibly distracted as the squirrel seemed to take a keen interest in her bouquet. As the couple exchanged their rings, the squirrel made its way to the front of the ceremony and perched on a nearby branch, looking straight at the guests. The groom, trying to stay composed, couldn't help but chuckle. It became a running joke for the rest of the evening. The ceremony ended with a group photo in front of the treehouse, and the squirrel, having claimed its spot on the branch, stayed right there, still observing the whole group as they celebrated below. The reception was equally quirky. Since the wedding was held in a treehouse, the guests had to enjoy their meal sitting on tree stump chairs around a long wooden table. Everything about the event felt rustic and natural, and even the cake was decorated with edible flowers and leaves. It was a wedding that combined nature, humor, and the charm of a unique venue. I've photographed plenty of weddings, but a treehouse wedding? That was definitely one for the books. Story 29. The wedding I shot in a hot air balloon was probably the most thrilling and nerve-wracking event I've ever been part of. The bride and groom were avid adventurers, and instead of a traditional wedding, they decided to have the ceremony in a hot air balloon, at sunrise no less. The couple, along with a small group of family members and close friends, took off from a field just outside the city. It was a beautiful, clear morning, and the plan was to exchange vows while floating above the countryside. As we ascended into the air, I had to keep my camera steady, hoping I wouldn't drop it while trying to get the perfect shot. The view was incredible, mountains in the distance, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. But things quickly became tense when one of the balloons started to malfunction. The basket swayed wildly, and I could feel the tension rise as everyone in the balloon tried to hold their balance. The pilot quickly took control, but there was this palpable sense of uncertainty in the air. Despite the nerve-wracking moments, the bride and groom were unfazed. They exchanged vows with the same calmness that they had shown when they first boarded the balloon. The vows were heartfelt, and the whole ceremony felt surreal, floating 2,000 feet above the ground with nothing but the wind around us. As they kissed, I snapped the perfect shot, capturing the moment in the most breathtaking backdrop. After the ceremony, we floated for about an hour, just enjoying the view and sipping champagne. The rest of the wedding took place at a nearby winery, where the couple, still buzzing from their high-altitude ceremony, celebrated with a reception that featured a vineyard tour and, of course, plenty of wine. The entire day had this magical, dreamlike quality to it, and I couldn't believe how surreal it was to photograph such an unforgettable ceremony. Story 30. One wedding I covered took a surprising turn when the bride and groom decided to forego traditional wedding vows in favor of a full-on improv comedy routine. The couple had always been fans of improv theater, so they thought it would be fun to create their own vows on the spot. What followed was one of the most ridiculous yet heartfelt ceremonies I've ever witnessed. The officiant, who was also an improv actor, encouraged the bride and groom to perform their vows as if they were characters from a comedy sketch. The groom started off by pretending to be an old-timey prospector, delivering his vows in a Western accent. "I vow to be your partner, for better or worse, through thick and thin, like two prairie chickens in the wild frontier." The guests were in stitches, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The bride, not to be outdone, took on the role of a pirate queen. She vowed, "I'll stand by your side through stormy seas and peaceful waters and be your first mate forevermore." The crowd couldn't contain their laughter, but it was clear that these two were madly in love with each other. It didn't stop there. After the vows, the couple performed a short improv scene where they pretended to be lost in a forest and had to find their way through their love for one another. It was equal parts absurd and sweet, and while it wasn't your typical wedding ceremony, it was certainly unforgettable. Later in the evening, the guests were invited to participate in an improv game where they had to come up with their own wedding vows. The whole event felt like an improv comedy show, with everyone getting involved in the laughter and lightheartedness. It was, without a doubt, one of the most unique weddings I've ever had the pleasure of photographing.